our last speaker for the convention. Cynthia, you have that privilege of being the last one. Sister Cynthia Hampton from Downey, California. From Lost in the Watchtower to Assurance in Christ. Frightened by the imminence of Armageddon, Cynthia was baptized as a teenager in 1972. When the world did not end in 1975, she began to question other teachings, and Jesus became her Lord, Savior, and Mediator in 1982. So we love to hear your story and some of the other information that you have, Cynthia. Thank you so much for coming.
It's really good to be here once again. I'm glad you all could stay. On my website, I have a copy of my testimony, and I have it beginning saying that my first introduction to the Watchtower was in around 1970. However, I started thinking about that, and I remembered that when I was a little kid, there was a Paradise book in my bookshelf, and this was probably before the age of 5 years old. I remember pulling that book down from the bookshelf and wondering what was in it. And I used to thumb through the pages, and I would see all these scary pictures of buildings falling down and people falling into massive holes and fires and things like that. And I found the book to be very, very frightening. And I wondered why that book was there. Now that I think about it, I wondered if my mother had studied way back then in around 1960, 61, 62, when that book was there. But if she did, I don't know about it, but I'm thinking that probably that's what happened, is that she was introduced to the Watchtower at that time. But by about 1970, a friend of ours that we had known for a long time in our neighborhood, she had been a catechism teacher at the church that we had gone to. And I remember that she had been one of our catechism teachers, and she was such a very, very nice lady. But after a while, I noticed that she wasn't there anymore, and I didn't know what happened to her. So in about 1970, my mother and I were grocery shopping, and we ran into this lady, and all of a sudden this lady starts talking up a storm, and she's talking about the world conditions, the same old tired lines that I got to know. So she starts a conversation with my mother at the store, and they start talking about the world conditions and how bad everything is, and they probably talked there in front of the meat counter for almost 2 hours. Anyway, this lady, she came to study with my mother. She started to study, and my mother began a weekly Bible study with her, or a book study from the Truth That Leads to Eternal Life. She had been on a crusade against the Catholic Church, my mother's friend, because evidently she'd had a disagreement with one of the priests at the time. So I believe that was her reason for getting involved with the witnesses. So in turn, she got my mother involved. I believe that my mother was looking for some kind of a way out because she was so unhappy in her life and in her marriage. My father's a lifelong alcoholic, and my mother was always very unhappy with that. She was unhappy with his friends and all the drinking that used to go on between my father and all his friends. So I think my mother was looking for an out. She was thinking that if she joined the witnesses, these were a clean bunch of people who were going to provide for her the kind of lifestyle that she wanted and give the lifestyle that she wanted for her family. And I guess she thought that my father would stop drinking. Well, surprise, surprise, he never did. Anyway, after my mother began to study, birthday celebrations came to a screeching halt. I remember that my last birthday that we celebrated was my 13th birthday. And soon my mother began dragging all of us to the Kingdom Hall. I have a brother, a younger brother who is 2 years younger than me, and I have another sister who is 6 years younger than me. So we all started going to the Kingdom Hall. And my mother arranged for myself and my brother and my sister to study with different people. And there was a very nice lady who really did who studied with me, and she was very, very nice to me. And it didn't take long before I believed the Watchtower was the truth. After going to one of the circuit assemblies, I was just ready to, really understand that the Watchtower had the truth, and I was ready to give up all the other teachings that I had learned from the Catholic Church. So we dropped the Catholic Church completely, quit going to the church, quit going to anybody's wedding or funeral that was in the church, and we started to separate ourselves from the rest of the family. In turn, my mother got my aunt or her older sister to study as well, and my aunt started to study as well as her 3 younger sons. Soon it was time to go to a district assembly, and that was out of town because at the time they did not use the Tucson Convention Center as one of the places for the assembly, or perhaps it wasn't built yet. I can't remember. But anyway, we were filling out the forms for lodging to go to a district convention, and on the form, and I'll never forget this, it asked what race you were. It asked if you were white, if you were black, or if you were Spanish. And I couldn't understand that because we were taught that all of Jehovah's Witnesses were brothers and sisters, and your race or your ethnicity should not matter. So when it asked if you were black or white or Spanish, and our family being of Mexican descent, I did feel very offended, and I know my mother and my aunt felt very offended at that same time, and they went to ask the elders. I don't think the elders provided a very good answer, because the answer that the elders gave my mother was, well, the reason they want to know if you're Spanish is because they want to find out if you're Puerto Rican. And I still didn't see what that had to do with it. So that was one thing that started to bother me, and that was, around 1972. And that kind of just sort of stayed in the back of my mind. Anyway, we all believed that Armageddon was coming in 1975. Everyone seemed to be speculating at when it would actually arrive. Some were even saying it could come in 1973, and it could come in 1974. So you just really, really have to be ready. I remember going to a district convention in 1973 in Oakland, California, and one of the district overseers that we had, I think it was Brother Salas, I'll never forget his example. He said, when an alarm clock is ready to ring, and just before it rings, there's a click, and there is a split second right before that alarm clock rings. Well, that is the time period that we're in right now. That's how much time we have before Armageddon. So the whole theme of that time that we were at that assembly was how much time we had before Armageddon. So being 1973, I was still in high school, and I decided that I was going to pioneer that summer, and I ended up auxiliary or temporary pioneering. I think that's what they called it back then. And I made sure that I got in my 75 hours a month, every month that summer. And I went door to door. I made return visits. I had book studies. I even arranged to go door to door after school started, because I kept a territory card that was assigned to me that had territory that was around my high school. So after school was out, I would make return visits on people. One of the things that I noticed was how parents would threaten their children with Armageddon. My mother used to do this constantly. She was always constantly threatening me that if I didn't behave and if I didn't do everything I was told, that I wasn't going to make it. I can't imagine threatening my own kids with their salvation today, because today I teach that God loves them no matter what. But back then, my mother said, okay, if you don't do as you're told, you're not going to make it through Armageddon. So we constantly lived in fear as kids. And because we thought there was so little time left, there were many, many teenagers that were getting married very, very young. some I noticed were getting married as young as 14 years old. And we were told by the elders that we were not allowed to date unless you intended to get married. So anybody that dated each other, of course, got married. And many times they were 15, 16 years old. And it seemed to be a very common thing that all these gals were getting married, and they were dropping out of high school. So there would seem like there was a frenzy of young teens getting married between 1973 and 1974. I remember of one of the girls who got married. She was 16 years old, and she got married to a 23-year-old who had just come back from Bethel. At the time, I thought she was really, really lucky because she was married to this really cool guy who had been at Bethel. But now I think the 23-year-old was kind of a pervert for going after a 16-year-old. They're like, what was he doing with her, and what was he thinking? So at that time, we thought that, if you weren't married by the time you were 18, you were pretty much an old maid. And then some of the elders and some of the other adults were telling us that, well, we didn't know whether there was going to be marriage in the new system. That, if you made it through Armageddon, it could be that you had to stay single for the rest of eternity. And that's kind of dangerous thinking when you've got kids that are teenagers, and so many people were making big mistakes. So they were getting married too young, and they ended up in a lot of very, very unhappy marriages, and including me. I got married in May of 1974. I had just turned 18 years old. And the guy I married turned out to be a wife beater. He started to hit me and to abuse me exactly 1 week after we were married. When I approached the elders with this problem and told them that my husband had been hitting me, their response was pretty much of disinterest. And I was told that there was nothing in the Watchtower about this, and that beating your wife wasn't exactly a disfellowshipping offense. It was considered to be a family problem, and they couldn't get involved. They said it was something I had to solve for myself. They told me that I needed to keep quiet about it, and that I needed to just be more submissive. Well, this family problem translated into a lot of physical and mental abuse. I carried bruises all over my body most of the time. I wore long sleeves so that nobody would see what was going on. Many times he would just hit me in places where you wouldn't be able to see. And I was told, don't ever discuss this with anyone, not even your parents. I was also told that the reason he was hitting me was because I nagged too much. And because I was constantly nagging him, that was probably the reason he was beating me, and I just needed to stop nagging and to be a better wife. So for a while there, I actually thought it was my fault and that I deserved the treatment I was getting. I was becoming very depressed, and at one point I was almost idealizing suicide, although I never really seriously considered it. And I just thought it would just be so much better to be dead than to go through all this abuse. Finally, my husband was disfellowshipped, but he wasn't disfellowshipped for beating me. He was disfellowshipped because he was caught smoking a cigarette. So I began to think, is smoking a worse sin than beating your wife? And so I weighed it out in my mind. I go, smoking on this side and beating your wife on this side. It's okay, smoking, beating your wife, smoking, beating your wife. What's worse? And in my mind, I'm thinking, beating your wife is a much worse thing than having a cigarette. However, I was glad that he was disfellowshipped, because then he became a nobody in the Watchtower organization. So that was my cue to get out of the marriage. In 1976, my son was also born. During that time when my husband was disfellowshipped, I had a son that was born. I was 20 years old. So I decided I could no longer take the abuse So I packed up my things, packed up my baby's things, and I went to live with my parents. They didn't really know about the abuse for a long time because I was told not to talk about it. They thought I was leaving because my husband was so irresponsible with the money and really refused to support us. I decided that I couldn't allow the abuse to continue, nor could I allow it to happen in front of my child and allow him to grow up seeing that. After I moved out, I filed for a legal separation, but I subsequently divorced him after a year went by, and I didn't tell the elders about it. The elders, however, told me that I would never be scripturally divorced, and I would not be allowed to date. I was 20 years old at the time. Can you imagine being 21 years old and being told you cannot date or have coffee with someone? I thought that was ridiculous, and in my mind I started doing a lot of critical thinking. After my son was a year old, I decided to enroll in a community college, and I decided I liked going to college. After all, I really hadn't studied very well when I was in high school because I was pioneering when I should have been studying. Armageddon was supposed to be around the corner, but instead of studying my books, I was out there going door to door and making return visits. So when I had left my husband, I had no means of getting a real decent job. And I didn't want to do what every other witness seemed to be doing, and that was becoming a cleaning lady or doing janitorial work. It just wasn't for me. I needed to do something with my brain, and I needed to do something that I thought was more like me. So I knew I had a brain up there, and I knew I had to use it by going to college. So it was already 1977 by this time, and Armageddon still hadn't arrived. After taking several classes and going to college full time, it began to seem to me that people in the Kingdom Hall were just not as intellectual as I was becoming. I was learning to do critical thinking, and I believed in asking questions at a time when independent thinking was starting to be frowned upon. I remember talking to an elder's wife one day and telling her that I was taking an introduction to psychology class, and I was telling her how much I really enjoyed it. And do you know what her response was? She actually had the audacity to tell me that I was studying doctrines of demons and that I should get out of my psychology class immediately. I was kind of angry when she said that, and I didn't listen to her. I did my own thing, but I felt very angry because of her ignorance. During this time period, my younger sister Jeanette, who had become an interpreter for the deaf at the Kingdom Hall, had a good friend of hers who had become disfellowshipped for apostasy. All she did was ask a few questions about the Watchtower belief system and questions concerning Scripture versus the Watchtower belief system. She talked with my sister about what she found out, how the JW beliefs conflicted with the Bible. So my sister decided to go to the elders and ask them those questions as well. The result was that my sister was now banned from doing any interpretation for the deaf. They didn't disfellowship her, but they just took away her privileges. She just one day came to the Kingdom Hall, found out that her name was crossed off the list for interpreting for the deaf. She asked one of my cousins why, who had become a ministerial servant at that time, and he says, "You're just off, period." No explanation, and she figured it was because she had asked questions. By 1979, I had all but quit going to the meetings. I think I went to one day of a district convention in Tucson that year, and I didn't even go out in field service at all by that time. I had had it by then, and I was very tired of trying to keep up with the whims of the Watchtower magazine. I didn't have time for the magazines, and I didn't have time for going door to door. I was just too busy with work, with school, and trying to take care of my son. The elders kept calling me at my home and asking for my time reports and basically trying to find out what I was up to. and they would ask me why I wasn't coming to meetings. I'd always dodge them. I felt they were looking, though, for a reason to disfellowship me. So in February 1980, I wrote a handwritten letter to the elders, letting them know I wasn't coming to any more meetings and not to consider me a Jehovah's Witness. I gave the letter to my brother to hand deliver to the elders, and that was my disassociation from the Watchtower. I had always had a few doubts about the Watchtower organization, which kind of made it easier to leave. For example, I never truly believed that it was wrong to get a blood transfusion. And I never, ever carried one of those no blood transfusion cards. I always knew that if I were looking death in the face and I was in an accident, I would accept a blood transfusion to save my life. Especially after my son was born, I knew that I wanted to live because I needed to raise him. Another thing that really bothered me was their teaching on rape and the screaming thing. I remember that when I had been in high school, a police officer had come to our school to speak to our girls' PE class on, what to do if you ever get in a situation where you might be raped. And his advice to the girls at the time was, if you feel like your life is in danger and he has a weapon, he's got a knife, he's got a gun, then the best thing to do would be to submit rather than lose your life. When I mentioned this at the Kingdom Hall to somebody, they said, absolutely not. You cannot submit to a rapist because you would be committing fornication. And then you would be disfellowshipped. And that kind of thing just, it didn't make sense to me at all. So I couldn't see why anybody would be committing fornication when they were being forcibly raped. So that was another thing that never made sense to me. So when I left, I never looked back, although I did attend the memorial in 1980, and that was the last time I ever went. That was the last time I was ever in a Kingdom Hall again. For the next 2 years, I was in limbo spiritually. I still believed in God, but I could never go into a Kingdom Hall. Yet I was puzzled at what the truth really was. For the next 2 years, I just pretty much lived the way I wanted to, and I did what was right in my own eyes. The Watchtower was no longer watching me, and I was going to enjoy life. So I worked, I went to school, I supported my son, and I made new friends. This was all to the dismay of my mother, who had told me that I was on the wide road leading to destruction. In 1982, a very good friend of mine invited me to his church. Now, this friend had been inviting me to his church since 1979. He lived in the apartment complex that I lived in when I had started college, and he lived right across from me. He came over one day, and I had told him that I was a Jehovah's Witness, and he told me he was a born-again Christian. And of course, I felt I had the truth, and he didn't. And when he heard I was a Jehovah's Witness, he said, "I'll pray for you." And I just looked at him and I said, and I thought, oh, poo-poo, you're not going to pray for me. I have the truth. But after I disassociated myself and lived without God for a couple of years, I finally accepted his invitation to go to his church. So there I was in February 1982, entering this evangelical Christian church that he had talked about so often. I was afraid of entering this church because of all the urban legends I had always heard about former JWs going into a church and something bad happening to them. Like, had you ever heard the one about a JW who decided to go to a relative's wedding and they entered the church, there was a chandelier on the ceiling, and then it came crashing down to the ground, killing the Jehovah's Witness who decided to go into this church? I thought that was going to happen to me because I walked in and I saw some of these hanging lamps, and I thought, oh, for sure one of these is going to fall down on me and I'm going to get killed. Well, I went in and nothing happened. I was okay. Then a strange coincidence seemed to happen. But, of course, in life, when we're dealing with God, nothing is a coincidence. I call it a God incidence. I went into this church, and I found that Christians were warm, loving, and caring people, and they seemed to care about me very much. My friend had told them that I was a former Jehovah's Witness, and they were very, very nice to me. But I was still scared. I found the music to be very inspiring. They had a praise and worship team. I'd never heard music like that before. Because when in the Kingdom Hall, of course, it's the Kingdom songs, and before that in the Catholic Church, it was a few of the hymns, but I never heard that many of them. So as I sat there in the church service, and I thought the pastor gave a very good sermon, but I was still kind of hesitant of what was going on. After the service was over, I kind of looked around, and and I kind of did a double take because I thought I saw a familiar face. And I looked at this woman from far off, and I thought, that lady looks familiar. I know I've seen her before somewhere. And as she came closer to me, I decided I was going to go up to her and find out who she was. I went up to her, and of course, I didn't know if she was just someone who looked familiar or if she was someone I actually had met before. So I went up to her, and I said to her, "Did I ever see you at any of the assemblies?" And I figured, well, if she didn't know what I was talking about, she would say, "No, you must be mistaken." And so I would leave it at that. And her eyes got wide, and she says, "Are you a former Jehovah's Witness?" And I said, "Yes." And she gave me a big hug, and she said she welcomed me to the church. And I didn't remember her name at the time, but she told me her name was Mary Kling. And it turned out that her husband is the cousin of Jim Penton. And so I got a chance to get to know her there. And of course, it wasn't really a coincidence that all the churches in Tucson, Arizona, and Tucson's a pretty big town of about 500,000 people, and it's got a lot of churches. This was the church that she was going to, and the Sunday that I went, there she was, and she was just so kind to me. And she had told me how there had been a newspaper written about her, and all the witnesses had said she was an apostate and everything. And then something clicked in my memory, and I remembered a couple years before there had been a newspaper article about an ex-witness, and my mother had been talking about it and saying that these people who left the Watchtower, these apostates, that woman in the newspaper, there's something wrong with her, she must be mentally ill. But Mary's not mentally ill. She's a very kind and loving person. She befriended me. She took me under her wing, and she showed me some of what was wrong with the Watchtower organization. See, at that time, I knew that there was something wrong with the Watchtower. I just didn't know what, and I just didn't know how to prove it from the Bible. So she showed me a few things from the Watchtower literature, and she showed me a page from the Watchtower that showed that Jesus was the mediator for only the 144,000. When I read that, I knew the Watchtower was a false organization, and the truth could only be found in Jesus Christ. Shortly thereafter that year, I gave my life over to Jesus Christ in May 1982. After I had started to attend this church regularly, I decided it was time to tell someone in my family. So I told my father. He was not baptized yet, but he was still indoctrinated. So I told my father that I had started going to this church and that I had become a Christian. Well, in turn, he told my mother, and a couple of weeks later, my mother and I had the biggest, worst fight you could ever imagine, and it ended with her screaming and yelling at me that I was now an apostate and that I was not welcome in her home ever again. She shunned me for the next 17 years completely, cutting off all contact with me. At the end of that year, I moved to Los Angeles, California, and began a new life away from my old friends and my family who had been shunning me in Tucson. I began to attend Calvary Chapel in Downey, California, and got involved with Bible study over there and women's Bible study. I had never studied the Bible like that before. I'd also started to listen to Christian radio, and I started to listen to the Bible Answer Man, Walter Martin. So a lot of my early Christian training came from the Bible Answer Man. Calvary Chapel has this nice little Christian bookstore there called the Chapel Store. One day I went in to buy myself a new Bible. And as I was browsing around, I found a section called Cults. Well, I already knew about Kingdom of the Cults. I had managed to order that book from somewhere. But as I carefully looked at the section that was labeled Cults, I found a large light blue paperback book that said Expose of Jehovah's Witnesses. And I started to look at that, and I'm like, wait a minute. This book is written by ex-witnesses. I didn't know at the time that there were books written by ex-witnesses. You know, I knew about Walter Martin, but he wasn't an ex-witness. So I got the book, I took it home, and I just devoured it. I wanted to meet Eric and Jean Grieshaber at the time. I didn't know where they were. They didn't have a phone number in the book, and there wasn't an address. So I decided at that time that I was going to try to find other ex-Jehovah's Witnesses somehow, because I only knew the one couple in Tucson, Arizona, and I thought, well, there's got to be more somewhere, you know. They can't all be hidden somewhere. So I was feeling kind of lonely, and you know, it's a little bit difficult, you know. Even though your Christian friends are very, very nice, you know, and they're very understanding, it isn't like having a friend who is an ex-Jehovah's Witness. So on Christian radio, there had been a talk show called Talk from the Heart. It was on KBRT AM in Los Angeles, hosted by Rich Bueller. And it was just one of those call-in talk radio shows where you would call in with an issue or a problem, and Rich Bueller would try to lead you to a solution or at least point you in the right direction. So one day I got the courage to call. I'm not the kind that likes to call-in talk radio shows. I had never called a radio show before, but I decided I had to tell him my dilemma of having been a JW. I didn't know what he could do for me, but I decided to call. So right away, when I described my problem to Rich, he said he had the answer for me. He said he had contacts with other ex-JWs, and he was going to put me in touch with them. This contact turned out to be Randy Waters, who lived in Manhattan Beach, 15 miles just west of me. So anyway, I got to finally meet Randy Waters, and who now runs the Free Minds ministry on the Internet. His ministry at the time was called Bethel Ministries, and I began to get to know him, and I was attending his quarterly potlucks and eventually volunteering in his home office to help him run his ministry at the time. I did a lot of the editing, and I did a lot of the proofreading for many of the articles that came in at that time. I did a lot of the proofreading for the book Refuting Jehovah's Witnesses. I'll always be grateful to Randy Waters because he was not only my friend, but he was my teacher and my mentor. And as a sidebar, I finally did get to meet Eric and Jean Grieshaber for the first time about 1985 or 1986. They finally came to speak over at Calvary Chapel in Downey, and that's when I finally got to meet them. I had been wanting to meet them all that time. And I did get to have them over to my house one time for brunch the next day. And I never got to see them again until I came here in 2001. At that time, Eric didn't remember me, but hopefully he'll get this tape, and then he'll never forget me. So after meeting Randy and other ex-JWs, I decided that I wanted to be in counter-cult ministry, but it was a little bit hard because I got married in 1984, and I had another couple of kids. I had a boy, Brian, in 1986, and Michelle in 1989, and it was almost all but impossible. But I did make it a point to be a referral to anybody who had come out of the Watchtower who needed assistance or support. In the summer of 1998, I found out that one of my Jehovah's Witness cousins, Andy Burns, who had by that time become an elder, developed leukemia at the age of 39. I had heard through the family grapevine that he had not been feeling well, that he'd been suffering from headaches and other health problems. After some tests and a diagnosis of acute leukemia, he was hospitalized for intense chemotherapy. He lived another 6 weeks. He lived another 6 weeks in the hospital before he finally died. Of course, being a JW elder, he refused all blood transfusions or blood products. His blood count had become dangerously low, so that chemotherapy had to be discontinued. After his death, I had found out that the Watchtower had required their members to sign a medical power of attorney. And this medical power of attorney was to ensure that someone else would be responsible for making sure that you did not receive a blood transfusion. This had all been new to me, and I was just flabbergasted to find out that the Watchtower had stooped so low in its enforcement of the blood doctrine. I also found out that my sister and I, who had left the Watchtower also in 1980, were on the hospital's not allowed to visit list that the family had made up. So there was no way that we could go visit my cousin before he died. However, one of my uncles, who never was a JW, could visit, and he made it a point to visit often before Andy died. The day before Andy died, my uncle visited him for the last time. Andy had pretty much fallen into unconsciousness. It was very emotional. And his breathing was labored. My uncle related to me how he went in to pray for Andy. And he had asked the Holy Spirit to come into the room, and he'd asked Jesus to come. He said he just continued to lay his hands on Andy and to just pray for him. He prayed for him for I don't know how long, maybe half an hour. Andy was breathing very labored, and it looked like he was maybe in a lot of pain. But as my uncle said he prayed, his breathing became much more peaceful. And all of a sudden, the color returned to his face. And then, a minute later, Andy took his last breath, and he died. Now, I don't know what happened at the last moment of his death. I would like to think that somehow my uncle's prayers did some good, and that somehow in my cousin's unconsciousness that Jesus was right there with him. Andy at the time was survived by his wife and 2 teenage sons. This family was torn apart in death by stupid Watchtower doctrines as more blood gets poured on the Watchtower altars. Who knows? Andy might still be alive today if it hadn't been for the Watchtower's doctrine on blood, if he'd been able to have blood transfusions and continue chemotherapy treatments. It's amazing how the Watchtower put so much importance on blood as a symbol of life rather than on life itself. Life itself is far more precious. Since when has a symbol of life become more important than the real thing? It's in this illustration that I often use with people. Suppose a kidnapper came into my home wanting to kidnap my daughter's photograph that hangs on the wall. The photograph is not my daughter, but only a symbol of who she is on a piece of paper. Should I tell the kidnapper or abductor, "Oh, please don't take the photograph. Please take my real daughter instead"? This kind of reasoning and mentality is present with how the Watchtower views blood and enforces that with their followers. The symbol of life has more value than the person's real life. In 1999, my mother decided to stop shunning me for a little while. She began to talk with me. She and my father decided to come over to my house and visit. They've spent time with us. They met my 2 younger children, Brian and Michelle, who were 10 and 13 at the time. I don't know what it was that triggered it, but at that time they decided to even go out to dinner with us, which had been a no-no for a very long time. My brother still has not talked with me. He's stopped talking to me in 1980 and still won't talk to me, not even by email. Recently I found out that my brother separated from his wife and he stepped down from being an elder. My sister and I are the only ones who have children, but my Jehovah's Witness brother never did have children, so my parents could not even enjoy grandchildren from my brother. So it's been very difficult for my children as well as my sister's children really not having grandparents to talk to. It was just a little while later that the Watchtower came out with the August 2002 Kingdom Ministry that once again instructed Jehovah's Witnesses to shun their members of the family who had left the Watchtower. So my mother started to obey that again. I no longer know where I stand with my parents. I know that my mother was very angry because she did find out that I have a website. And she found out that I run a support group for ex-Jehovah's Witnesses. She has refused to acknowledge the recent issues about the Watchtower, including Silent Lambs concerning child sexual abuse, and claims it's just baloney. I feel sorry for her because she does not know the real Jesus. After all, Jesus did say in John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. My mother's life is tied up with an organization that will never show her the real Jesus Christ. It is an empty organization with false promises and false prophecies, and the Bible never talks about joining an organization for salvation. Some people ask me, after leaving the Watchtower organization, where else can we go? But I always tell them, it's not about where. It's who do we go to? Read John 14:6. Years, and Jesus is Lord of my life. With the internet, I've been able to make many contacts with people who are coming out of the organization. But that's not all. My first contact with support groups on the internet was with Women Awake, which is a support group for ex-JW women. So I started to get on that group and meet a whole lot of nice ladies. I then found another group called Christian Ex-Jehovah's Witnesses on Yahoo. And I found that I seemed to have a knack with corresponding with hurting ex-JWs over email. I'm a pretty good writer. After a few months of being active on that group, the group's owner, Teresa Weisberg, asked me to help her moderate that group. This online group now has grown to over 350 members. The goal of the group is to provide a safe place for ex-Jehovah's Witnesses who still embrace the moral values that the Bible teaches to meet and have online fellowship. This group is about challenging you to go beyond the hurt and the pain brought on by having been a JW and to stop using the victimhood of having been a Jehovah's Witness to justify every problem in your life. Our vision is to see you become overcomers in Christ by leading holy lives. Leading a holy life as a Christian ex-Jehovah's Witness is the most powerful witness of Christ a Jehovah's Witness will ever see. We have a picture of on our website of Jesus knocking at the door with no doorknob on his side, and I always tell people we need to open our hearts to Jesus. I also started another online group that was more local for California, and I called it Ex-Jehovah's Witnesses California, which currently has about 175 members. We are also a support group, but we are more geared to the needs of California. My co-moderator is Stan Covell, who lives in Northern California. He's been a wonderful help to me and a good friend, and it seems to be a great balance between the two of us. The group is comprised mostly of ex-JWs who are now Christians, but being a Christian or living in California is not a requirement to join the group. However, we do focus on a lot of issues affecting Christianity and ex-JWs in California. We sometimes even talk about politics, and the recent recall election in California seemed to be a big issue lately. One of our members was even working on the Arnold Schwarzenegger campaign. I also help moderate a group called XJWs in West Virginia. What am I doing on that group? I'm in California. But the group's owner, Ron Owens, started the group when he was fresh out of the Watchtower. When I first met Ron online, he was really open to the things of Christ, but he was still really scared. He had been badly hurt by a marriage that he had just gotten a divorce from, and he had been recently remarried to another lady who was a Jehovah's Witness. And I wanted to help him out and encourage him to find a good Christian church to go to. So with Ron being in West Virginia, I put my thinking cap on and I said, Ron, how far are you in Princeton from Beckley, West Virginia? And he says, about 30 minutes. And I said, well, let me give you Paul Blizzard's email address, and I'll give you the address of his website. And you can contact Paul Blizzard because he's a former Jehovah's Witness who's now pastoring a church down there. So I did that. Ron and his wife Bridget started going to that church, and they met Paul Blizzard and got to know them really well. And finally, I believe that Ron was baptized as a Christian in April 2002. I can't tell you what a blessing Ron Owens has been to me. Every day he writes a devotion on this group called Thought for the Day in Prayer. If anybody has a problem or concern, they can write to Ron, and he will include it in that day's thought and prayer. So I'm very thankful and grateful to Ron Owens. He's just been such a blessing. Last year, in the spring of 2002, I decided after much thought and prayer to start a real live, in-person support group for XJWs. I'm not a real great people person, so starting this was kind of a step out of my comfort zone. Yet I felt I was being called to do this, so I decided to give it a try. I checked with my church, and I asked about being able to use possibly our church's youth center building for the once-a-month meetings. The pastor was really quite excited about this, and he told me he gave me the green light, and he said, go ahead. So after having made the decision, I posted on the internet my intentions of starting the in-person support group. My close friend Randy Waters of Free Minds also put the word out on his NetSuite portion of his website. The word seemed to get out very, very quickly. Soon I had people telephoning me who were very excited about the prospect of going to a support group. And my phone seemed to be ringing off the hook, and they were all saying the same thing. I've been praying for a very long time for someone to start a support group for XJWs. Thank God it's you. So I started the support group, and it's been very, very successful. I have about 12 to 15 people who come each and every time. We have potlucks. We have a lot of fun together. We meet on a monthly basis. We usually talk about Christian issues. I don't push because sometimes people coming in aren't Christians, and although they have questions about Christianity, they have questions about Jesus, we try to answer their questions. We have other Christians in the group who are very helpful to me. We have an elderly couple who were in the Watchtower for 50 years, and they're now Christians. So we have a really good mix of people. It's just been very good and very encouraging because for example, I just got a lady who walked in who just left the Watchtower in December. Her husband died, and she needed some help and support and didn't know what to do. So she came to my support group. So that not only, is the support group, it's just been a big blessing to me. My support on the internet and the contacts I've made have led me outside of California back to my hometown of Tucson, Arizona. I got a call from the director of AJWRB. You might know him as Lee Elder. Lee Elder turned out to be an old friend of mine that I used to know when I was a teenager in the Witnesses. And in Tucson, and he called me one day and he said, there's this lady who needs help and support, and it was a blood transfusion issue. So I found out where this lady was, and it turned out that she had ovarian cancer, and she had had cancer while as a witness, and she had just gotten married to another Jehovah's Witness, a fine ministerial servant, who happened to dump her 6 weeks after the wedding when he found out she had ovarian cancer. She ended up in a homeless shelter, and I went to Tucson to visit her after she made her way back to Tucson from Indiana. So there she was, and she had decided to disassociate herself in July of 2001, and she was needing some friendship and support from other ex-Jehovah's Witnesses. So I went to see her. She was a wonderful lady. Her name was C.J. Maurer, and we became very good friends. I just have to mention her because I felt like this woman was truly a blessing in my life as I saw her suffering with cancer and suffering and through the chemotherapy and the hair loss and everything. She never once blamed God. You know, she became a Christian, and Jesus was Lord of her life. The last time I saw her was the day before she died. She had gone into hospice care last November, and I wanted to go see her, so I made arrangements to go out to see her one weekend. By the time I got there, she had fallen into a state of unresponsiveness, although she knew I was there. And I came in, and I held her hand, and I told her about a dream that I had had the night before. I dreamed that I saw her in heaven, and that she had long and flowing hair, and that she looked beautiful. And I said that was my vision of her heavenly home someday, that she was going to go to very, very soon. So I stayed there and I prayed with her for about 10 minutes, held her hand, and we were just alone together for that time, and then pretty soon other people came to visit. We were all there for several hours with her. Finally, in the evening, we decided to leave, and I got a call the next morning telling me that she had died that night. I like to think that she had waited for me, and I will be forever grateful to have known C.J. Maurer and the blessing that she was to me and to many other people. I'm not a psychologist or a mental health professional. In fact, I work in the field of accounting. So when I have my support groups, I usually start off with a 5-minute message with something encouraging or some kind of humor to put people in the frame of mind that I believe that is conducive to Christianity and spirituality and healing. Of course, I don't push Jesus on everybody, as I believe that the Holy Spirit is a gentleman, and I'm not out to convert anybody. I concentrate on their healing first, and I make no judgments about their lives. I want everybody to think of my support group as a safe place that they can go and find others like themselves. My goal is that they move on with their lives in a healthy way, instead of being bitter about spending X number of years in the Watchtower organization. Of course, we almost always end up talking about salvation and the Bible, and I do leave it up to the group. My husband, who has never been a JW, usually sits in on those meetings as well. He has a degree in Christian education from Azusa Pacific University, so he's there to answer any kind of Bible questions or any questions concerning Christian doctrine. So I feel like he's well equipped to answer many of the questions. And actually, I'm fairly quiet during the meetings, and I end up in silent prayer for many of these people. The great thing about our support group is that they all seem to really like each other. I have a 2-hour increment from 2 to 4 that we have our meetings, but everybody wants to stay a lot longer. We have our potlucks, and last August we even had a picnic. So we end up doing a lot of fun stuff together just to basically get to know each other and have fun. Some people ask me, if I had to do it all over again, would I do anything different? Well, actually, I would have to say no. I wouldn't have done anything different. Life has its bumps and its scrapes in life, and life has not been perfect. But I sure have learned a lot. After leaving the Watchtower, I married a man who did not embrace Christianity. He's the father of my 2 younger children, and he also adopted the son I had from my marriage that was born to me as a JW. The marriage ended in divorce after 10 years of marriage. I think part of the problem, among others, was that he didn't understand my JW background and how hurt I was from all the shunning in my family. I married again to a Christian in 1996, to a man who loves me and cared and loved my children and wanted to help me raise them. We have been married now for nearly 7 years. He's been very good to me, and he has earned my children's love and respect. If it hadn't been for Dave's encouragement and support, I probably wouldn't be here today. In fact, when I first came here in 2000, he was the one who booked my flight out here because he felt it was important for me to be here. Well, he didn't know what he was getting into because I've wanted to come every year since. This is my 4th Witnesses Now for Jesus convention, and I have attended in a row. I've also been going to Dan Hall's Grace Conferences that is held a little closer to home in California. I am just so grateful to God and to have met so many wonderful people here, especially to Joan Sentnar and to the McGregors, who have been an inspiration to me. Also at the Grace Conferences, I have been grateful to Dan Hall, who has become a very, very good friend, and also to Don Nelson, who I've come to admire and respect very much. Hopefully I'll be able to come every year because this place is the shot in the arm that I need every year. If it hadn't been for coming here and to the Grace Conferences, I would not have been as inspired to start my online support groups and do the live in-person support group. I'm also thankful to my husband Dave, who has been a support to me this last 7 years and has shown me the unconditional love that even though we've had our rocky times. But most of all, I'm thankful to God, the Father, and His Son, Jesus Christ, for snatching me out of the Watchtower, away from the constant confusion, into the assurance of salvation that He promises.